Welcome to the 34th year, the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch November lecture of the World War II History Roundtable in Minnesota. Thank all of you for coming out. I know it's been a tough night, but we're moving forward. I want to introduce Connie Harris. Connie was a student of Harold Deutsch, has done much research on his life, and will give the purpose of tonight's lecture and do the introduction of our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. As Don said, tonight is the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch lecture, and we often hear about topics dedicated to his research and his life. Over the years, we've had speakers like Doug Waller discussing Wild Bill Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, and then Waller came back and talked about Donovan's disciples, those men who worked for Donovan and each in turn became head of the CIA. Also, we've had David Kahn, who spoke on code breaking in World War II, the late Ken Heckler, presenting on his interrogations of the German prisoners at Mondorf, Luxembourg, Peter Hoffman and Danny Orbach speaking on the conspiracy against Hitler, and of course Michael Basler on the forgotten trials of the Holocaust. During this lecture, we've also heard about the United States and its allies. In 2017, we had William T. Johnson, Professor of Military History and Strategy at the Department of National Security at the U.S. Army War College. And he's the author of The Origins of the Grand Alliance. And he spoke on the pre-World War II planning between the U.S. and Great Britain. In 2019, last year, when it was normal, we had Mark Stoller, the Professor Emeritus from the University of Vermont, who wrote Allies and Adversaries, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Grand Alliance, and U.S. Strategy in World War II. He explored the struggle between the commands and staffs of the Allied forces to achieve victory in coalition warfare. And with tonight's speaker, we dig deeper into the dynamics of Allied military command structure, focusing on one man, Walter Bedell Smith. Dr. Dan Crosswell received his PhD at the Kansas State University.
Yeah, don't get that wrong.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to be in trouble if I mix up my two Kansases. And is now the Colonel Richard R. Halleck Distinguished University Chair in Military History at Columbus State University in Columbus, Georgia. Besides his biography on Beetle Smith, he also co-authored a book with Colonel Ralph Puckett, Ranger, A Soldier's Life. Yeah, I said everything. So, without further ado on anything technical, here's Dan Crosswell.
Thank you very much. So, I'm a Calvinist, and so I love the fact we're in the middle of a pandemic, blizzard, with an IT failure. That's my life. Yeah, Beetle. So when we talk about Beetle, we have to talk about the Ike Beetle team. Right? And it's more than simply the good cop, the bad cop. Now, it's unusual because I have written two biographies of Beetle Smith. One derived from my dissertation that I then translated into a book. It won an award, and I was only 28 when it was published. Right? I was a callow youth. And I bought into the good cop, bad cop. And I did Beetle Smith an injustice. And I underestimated his worth and at the same time overestimated General Eisenhower's. So in the field of history, we are taught and we're supposed to teach that, that history is this clash of great Teutonic forces. It's geology, right? And pressure builds until something happens, right? And that individuals, personalities don't matter. They're just actors in the play. Well, you can't understand World War. Well, I'm a biographer, first of all, so I dismiss that. But you can't look at World War II without looking at personalities. Hitler, Roosevelt, Churchill, Allenbrook, Marshall, De Gaulle, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, right? And they all grew up in what was called the belly poke, the period before the First World War. And as Barbara Tuchman said, nothing as malignant as the Great War could grow out of a belly poke, right? And so the First War produced the Second, with some of the same cast. Personalities matter. Personalities matter. And especially in terms of, you're looking at American command and staff structure. Americans seem to assume that structure came down from Moses. Right? Actually, it was improvised in 1917. Right? And this confusion between active operational theater level command and theater support and supply also is a product of age-old conflict between staff and line. Right? So of course the operators get all the publicity and multiple books, but no one really looks at chiefs of staffs. So that's what. So don't take my word for it. What was Eisenhower's estimation of Beetle Smith? First as the chief of staff. Smith's organizational and executive abilities are so outstanding that the beneficial effects of his presence are constantly evident. By all odds, the most competent and marvelous chief of staff that any commander was ever lucky enough to have. I don't know how I, without him, would have carried on. Obviously, it's also important in terms of the American relationship with the British as well as the French. His standing with the British is so high that Montgomery remarked that General Beetle Smith was one of the 2 American generals under whom he would willingly serve. Now, he didn't mention the other one, and I don't think it was Eisenhower. And Smith was the best chief of staff ever. There's more. The debt he owed to Beetle Smith. Regarding Smith, I should buy a fishing rod and write home every week about my wonderful accomplishments in winning the war. If ever I should write any memoir, I should certainly have to devote a full chapter to the debt I owe Smith. I think most tellingly, a great soldier of France, de Lattre du Tassigny, once assured me that my place in military history was secure, since the only requisite for an enduring spot in the history of battles was wisdom in selecting a chief of staff. He went on to say that no one in World War II was quite as wise, or at least as fortunate, as I was in this regard. And finally, Smith's contribution to Allied victory. Smith contributed as much, often far more, to win the war than those names most often appear in the papers or in history books. Smith comes close to being the ideal chief of staff. Furthermore, contributions Smith has made to Allied success simply cannot be exaggerated, and I think, as an exclamation mark, no single man in Europe contributed more to Allied success than Walter Bedell Smith. So the chief of staff. 2 things here. One, when queried why it was that Roosevelt was insisting that General Marshall take command of Overlord, in fact, all of the European theaters of operation. And his reply was, well, you and I know who was chief of staff during the Civil War, the Union chief of staff, but nobody else does. I'd hate to think in a generation or 2 no one would know the name of George C. Marshall. And the reality is, no one knows the name of George C. Marshall. Right? They may know it. He lost China. He was the driving force behind the Marshall Plan. But no figure in American military history had more of an impact on his army in that generation than Marshall did. Not Pershing, not Grant, not anybody, not even Washington. Another thing, of course, is coming from that is no senior officer was put in a place without the consent of Marshall. Not that he had a crystal ball. Marshall had a horrible memory, especially for names. By the way, the myth that there was a black book is not true. Larry Bland, who was the first organizer of the Marshall Papers and was the editor of the published Marshall Papers, went through everything that ended up in Lexington, Virginia, and he assured me that it didn't exist. It's a good myth, but he should have kept the black book. Any case. And this is the convergence of Smith first, rather than Ike. In other words, Marshall found Smith before he found Eisenhower. Now, Clausewitz talks about imponderables of war. One imponderable, well, one is genius. I'm not going to say Beetle Smith's a genius, or Eisenhower for that matter, or Marshall for that matter. But chance, luck. And again, personalities are important. So how is it that Marshall discovers Beetle Smith? Well, after taking over as Chief of Staff of the Army on the 1st of September 1939, the very day the Germans invaded Poland, he began his tentative at first restructuring of the War Department General Staff. And the real driver of the War Department General Staff was the Secretariat. And so he had, Orlando Ward was the secretary, he had 2 assistants. One was named Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley, as we mentioned earlier, was not a wordsmith. He couldn't put together a coherent paragraph. Now Marshall was tired of having to vet everything that Bradley was writing. Now the thing is that if you had a cold sore, any kind of malady, you were already suspect in the eyes of General Marshall, so exacting. So Bradley's career is on the line. So when Bradley goes into Marshall's office and he says, well, do you remember back in 32, and you went into this a classroom and a young student was delivering his research paper on the Ain Marne offensive, and you were so impressed you remarked on that when he came back to the office. Well, of course, Marshall was totally blah on that, but he depended upon his subordinate, and he said, Bradley, if this man's available, bring him. Again, pure happenstance. But that is how Smith comes in the orbit of General Marshall. So he's number 3 in the pecking order. But almost immediately, he wins Marshall's confidence. And what happened always was, you had to go through the initiation rite. So you're just now brought into the War Department. So you're brought into the chief's office. It might be soon, it might be later. And there you stand at attention, and he's reading a paper with his bifocals. And then he'll look up with those steely blue-gray eyes and freeze the person. And then ask a question 3 or 4 levels above his grade. And if the officer can't, well, if he freezes, then he's gone. He's gone. Obviously, Beetle Smith passed that. He passed that. The other connection it was Beetle Smith, by this time Secretary of the General Staff, who puts the phone call through to Sam Houston to bring Eisenhower into the War Department General Staff. We'll forego the biography. Again, what's important, of course, are those 3 stints at the infantry school, around which are sandwiched 2 years at the Commanding General Staff School and the 1 year at the War College. Okay. Tellingly, Smith writes, the year I spent working as Secretary of the General Staff for George Marshall was one of the most rewarding of my entire career and the happiest in my life. So again, he is a major, then lieutenant colonel, then a colonel, but he's performing tasks way beyond his grade, right? Punching way above his weight. And that was typical of Beetle Smith. He'd take on responsibility. He'd make decisions. And that's what Marshall liked. Pearl Harbor. Churchill immediately knows he's going to win the war. And then he jumps on a fast battleship and he makes his way towards Washington. What he wants to do is pin down the United States on the Germany first strategy And secondly, is put together a mechanism for global warfare. Smith is Secretary of the General Staff, and it's incumbent upon him now to play a central role in the orchestration, the organization, and the driving of the creation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all of the combined and joint committees that were part of this new structure. The other thing that was decided at the Arcadia Conference was the creation of a Supreme Command, both combined and joint, in a theater of operation. Most people look at other conferences during the war, but Arcadia has to rank among the top three, because what follows after that is the blueprint was already laid. And Smith plays the key role, because not only was he the engineer in terms of fashioning the Joint Chiefs and the joint and combined committees, but he also drove it because the engine was always the Secretariat. What's important here is the relationship with the British. Now, the British had this finely tuned, burnished machine called the Committee Command System, British Chiefs of Staff. And so with the British Chiefs of Staff, they already have staffed out and made a decision, so when they present that final decision, everybody at every echelon knows what's going on. Right? American system is just the opposite. So what's happening here is the Navy doesn't want to buy into anything that's joint, and this is a problem. But a bigger problem is the difficulty that may emerge between the British and the Americans. Now, even though Vivian Dykes was Brigadier General and Beetle is only a colonel, Marshall insists that Beetle Smith become now the secretary not only of the War Department General Staff, but also the Joint Chiefs and the Combined Chiefs. Two things. One, his ability to cooperate with the British. Arguably, Vivian Dykes was his closest friend. When Vivian Dykes' plane goes down coming back from the Casablanca conference, he writes Dykes' wife and says, "Other than you and the children, no one feels his loss more than me." That's very untypical Smith. That's very atypical Smith. This bond of friendship, but more, as importantly, he understands that the British system works. Right? And of course, the American system not working. And nor will it work for the duration of the war. I could get into it, but I won't. So the two foundations of the special relationship were, of course, Field Marshal Dill, who was permanently seconded to Washington and the Combined Chiefs of Staff with General Marshall, and Dykes, a Brigadier General, and Beetle, soon to be a BG as well. Eisenhower comes in and eventually takes over War Plans Division. So they're working together in tandem during these hectic days after Pearl Harbor and the formation of the Joint and Combined Chiefs of Staff. I could say more, but I won't. The top priority, now that we've decided that it's going to be a Europe First strategy, is Operation Bolero. Operation Bolero was the buildup of American forces both for a cross-channel attack in 1943, perhaps even in 1942 under an emergency, but also the mounting of what becomes the combined bomber offensive. And it was badly stalled. Ike goes over to inspect ETO, comes back saying they're still working interwar War Department hours, nothing's happening, it's a disaster. And keep in mind, the Americans are pushing for a cross-channel attack in 1942. Typically American, they want to happen now. Now the British are not going to hazard the entire game on something that they know is a forlorn hope. Just as in the case of Napoleon, the British are going to fight a peripheral strategy. So Churchill is pushing FDR into Operation Gymnast, which eventually becomes Torch. It's not going very well. Now the problem is Smith by this time is indispensable to Marshall in his many tasks. And what this does is guarantees Eisenhower is pleading for Smith to become his chief of staff. It's not happening because Marshall's not going to release him. But the situation is so desperate that Marshall has to sacrifice Smith. And Mamie says Beetle will save Ike. In some respects, he does. Because immediately upon arriving in Norfolk House, the headquarters of ETO, things begin to click. Beetle Smith takes out his cat of nine tails. He's just like General Marshall. Even his technique was take out a stopwatch and you had 3 minutes to find a document. 3 strikes. First strike is you took the rest of the day off. Second strike was you took the rest of the week off. Third strike, just pack your bags, you're gone. Right? Demanded efficiency. It was his headquarters. So he is the general manager of the war. And so suddenly the logistical picture improves, in no small measure because Somerville is beginning to ship everything he can. He's stripping American divisions in training of their equipment and arms in order to move that material for the torch operation. Any case. So the métier of the team begins to be established in those early days of September 15 until 8 November when torch takes place. Eisenhower, very important book analyzing Eisenhower's command style as a president. The book's titled The Hidden-Handed President. So I incorporated much of that, looking at Eisenhower in terms of his command style as a general. Right? So torch mostly miscarries because they can't take Tunisia, again for logistical reasons, complicated, but that bottom line, that's it. It's a stalemate. The Germans are easily able to move manpower and material by sea, but also by air. They have hardened airfields, they have air superiority. They have 2.5 times as many troops. Eisenhower figures he's going to lose his command. He also sick. He caught a viral infection in the catacombs of Gibraltar before torch, and he never really shook it. So he pulls himself out of bed, he takes a flight to Casablanca, the 4-engine aircraft is down to 1 engine. He puts on a parachute because he figures they're going to ditch the aircraft. He lands, he's badly shaken, he's sick. His performance is abysmal. He has a few drinks and dinner with his buddy George Patton, and Eisenhower says, I'm going to get cut loose. Right? But he doesn't get cut loose. What the British do is they kick him into the stratosphere. What they do is they now place a British admiral in command of all Allied naval forces in the entirety of the Mediterranean, air forces under Tedder, and all ground forces under General Alexander. A visiting delegation of congressmen says, okay, Alexander commands the ground, Tedder the air, Cunningham the sea. What exactly does Eisenhower command? The answer was barely his own self-respect. And what we see is that there's a lack of grip in the theater. In the conclusion of the operations in Tunisia, although a brilliant success, the planning and staging of Operation Husky in Sicily, and the inability of the Allies, despite air superiority, naval superiority, far more ground forces, to not only prevent the Germans on their own terms from pulling out their manpower and their heavy and their transport and armor, but also allowing them to escape from Sardinia and Corsica, all to fight another day. During this time, Eisenhower is sequestered for 6 days on what was called slowdown medicine, at the height of all of this, right? So again, he's not asserting himself as supreme commander. So there's a constant fight between Eisenhower and Smith. Smith is constantly pressuring Eisenhower to assert his command authority, which he never does. And secondly, to reorganize the headquarters and logistics. I'm not going to get into that. It's just too complicated, and we don't have the time. So Eisenhower's command style really can be defined as passive negative. And one element of that is it avoids anything political. Remember, these guys never voted, so political was anything that wasn't narrowly military. And any kind of confrontation at all. This, of course, he learned in the interwar period. This he especially learned from the Darlan affair. So what happens is when they land in North Africa, Darlan just happens to be there, not really, but he's there. They cut a deal. He's number 2 under Pétain and Vichy. He's a collaborator. But they cut a deal for military reasons, expediency. And the outcome of this is a firestorm of opposition from Parliament and Congress and the British and American press. Churchill is even facing a vote of no confidence over this issue. This burns Eisenhower, and that's a lesson he will never forget. And so that means he delegates responsibility not only to be the general manager of the headquarters of Bedell Smith, but also to be his foreign minister. To deal with the British, but also to deal with the French and anything remotely political. Never asserts his command authority, we've already pointed to that. His bouts of temper and his health problems. His insistence on exercising linear command authority. His refusal to alter the headquarters structure, and his refusal his determination to always stay the course. Without getting into the whole quotation that was highlighted in red, is most important, I should add that one of my problems has been to control my temper, a temper that I have had to battle all my life. This is very important. So he avoids anything that smacks of confrontation, because if he loses it, which he's predisposed to do, then it could be disastrous. And what that means, he sublimates all this anxiety inside him. So there's 2 faces of Ike. Right? The smiling Ike, everybody likes Ike. He even pulls off being a good-looking bald man. But at the same time, there is this other darker Ike, right? That Eisenhower struggles to keep under control. Right? Which is very difficult to do when you have a combined and joint headquarters and having to deal with people like de Gaulle, Giraud, and others. Eisenhower was such a good poker player that he stopped playing poker because he's taken too much money from his comrades, right? So then he became a master bridge player. But he's a poker player. He's a poker player. He knows when to hold. Again, this passive negative leadership. He said, "This is a time for us to move patiently and slowly. We must not be too quick to say what we want to do." And he has this Mr. Macabre, something will always turn up approach to problem solving. In periods of great stress, quote, "the calamities that are anticipated never really occur," end quote. Confirming sometimes, as he frequently said, the best decisions are those never made. Right? And again, how he handles subordinates. Typically the way Eisenhower handled people, he could chastise you very thoroughly, and you came away feeling almost great you had committed a sin. Now that happened rarely because that was Beetle's job, right? The lack of grip on or direction from Allied Force headquarters in terms of operations. Right? Montgomery once told Patton, "Pay no attention to what Alexander says, do your own thing," which he did, which was Sicily, right? And we see this here because the race to Messina is a myth. Because at this meeting at Syracuse, Patton flies in, figuring he's going to hear the worst. Monty's there, it's his headquarters. Monty knows he can't break through. What he wants is the end run. Gives Patton exactly what he wants. They cut the deal. The aircraft from advanced headquarters in Tunisia was delayed, and so Smith, representing Allied Force headquarters, and Eisenhower and Alexander, the Army Group Commander, ground commander, fly in, and the Signal Corps took this photograph. The decision was already made, right? Again, lack of grip. Now, in terms of politics, long story short, this is probably the most interesting episode in Smith's career. He engages in secret diplomacy with a representative from the Italian, one of the factions of the Italian General Staff. Secret meetings in Lisbon. And he essentially strong-arms the Italians into accepting the short terms with no mention of unconditional surrender as a means to expedite Italy's withdrawal from the war. Again, a lot of complications. Smith's at the middle of this, Eisenhower's nowhere. In the end, the result is the signing of the short-term capitulation in Sicily, and of course, Beetle signs it. Now, this photograph, I think, captures it all. Look at the stress that Beetle is under. Right? He was always superbly coiffed. Right? And look at the uniform. And then Eisenhower flies in, because communications were bad. He waltzes in, Signal Corps is there, shakes Castigliano's hand, and it's over. Right? That's how things work. Chafe, right? So Eisenhower gets the big command, not Marshall. And he insists that Beetle accompany him to London. Now, Eisenhower is ordered by Marshall to come back to Washington. It's the last thing Ike wants to do, to go back to Washington, because what's awaiting him in Washington? Mamie. Kay Summersby. Meanwhile, Montgomery is designated ground commander. Eisenhower doesn't want Montgomery for obvious reasons. He wants Alexander. A Canadian staff officer once said of Alexander, he is bone from the neck up. Easy to manipulate. You can't manipulate Monty. So Monty's already there before Christmas. Beetle's there before Christmas. And what emerges is really Montgomery's plan for the first and second phase of what becomes later known as Overlord. Eisenhower's not there. So the foundation's laid. In those the last week in December and the first 2 weeks of January 1943, 1944. Okay. Again, Beetle wrote a serial in the Saturday Evening Post, which later was brought together as a book called Eisenhower's 6 Great Decisions. So what I'd like to do is use that as a template to look at how things went in Northwest Europe. Again, Operation Overlord written large. Now again, my point is, Eisenhower is only resolute when he decides not to do something. Now you might say, well, what about the decision to launch D-Day? Storm, we all know the story. That's true. But the real decision was not to go. It was not to delay. If they waited another month, that's one less month of the campaigning season, and no one had a crystal ball. If the weather was bad on the 5th of June, it was far worse a month later. The biggest storm in 70 years. Would have been a disaster. It's a great decision, as it turns out. Now, the two people he turned to in that staff conference, meanwhile, the rain is pelting on the windows, right? One is Monty. And Monty says, if I were you, Ike, I'd say go. The last person he turned to was Smith. Well, Smith said, what this does, it gives us a window of opportunity, because the Germans will not think we're coming. Upon that advice, Eisenhower walks over. Again, he looks up, rain pelting on the windows, and then he says, it's a go. Right? All right. That's one. Double envelopment. Okay. So the master plan, after the Battle of Normandy was achieved, and again, huge debate, doesn't go according to plan. Of course, Montgomery insists it did, and basically it does do that. The plan always was that the British would take Caen. It's supposed to happen on D-Day. It doesn't happen that way. With the sheer knowledge that would attract most of the German armor, because again, that was the path to open tank country and beyond that Paris, and also blocking German reinforcement coming from the Pas-de-Calais. Meanwhile, as Monty said, Caen is the key to Cherbourg. Because Cherbourg was the key because, again, it was all about logistics, the buildup. Once Cherbourg was taken, then the American forces would build up, and the attack was always planned to be in the vicinity of St. Lo, exactly as it happens on the 35th of July. Now, Smith plays the key role in orchestrating the combination of all of this enormous planning of the mounting and execution of D-Day. And he was so worn down by this. He had a chronic stomach issue that he said he didn't think he would survive another campaign. And that wasn't even an active campaign, that was simply the planning of the campaign. All right, as we all know, St. Lo happens 35 July. That triggers the activization of Third Army Patton. Perfect situation. Patton, open field runner, breaks through. And the idea was the key was to cordon off the Brittany Peninsula. The whole plan, Overlord was not an operational plan, it was a logistical plan. Those phase lines were not operational, they were logistical. And it depended upon opening up those Brittany ports. Because those Brittany ports were connected to Paris with major railway trunk lines. And as in World War I, the plan in World War II was all those follow-on American divisions would be staged and trained in Brittany. Right? That was the plan. That was the plan. But again, the operators aren't worried about logistics. They see the possibility of the double envelopment of German 7th Army, actually an entire German Army group. So operations, as always, trumps the logistics, and the result is they don't complete the envelopment, right? All right. And again, so here's what we're looking at, including we know about those two artificial harbors in Normandy, D-Day. What most people don't know is that in the Philadelphia Naval Yards, they created an even larger artificial harbor in Operation Chastity. So the idea was that this artificial harbor would accommodate 10,000 tons a day. And the other ports in Brittany, another 16,000. And then, of course, once those rail lines were opened up, then you move towards Paris, because anybody who's traveled by train in France knows you can't go anywhere unless you go through Paris. Everything converges there. Meanwhile, that decision means that until late October, all the American supplies, virtually all, come across the beaches, because Cherbourg is never open. It is, but doesn't begin to match projections. And the other problem is that you only have one rail line. It's a single rail line that runs from Cherbourg to Caen to Paris. Can't handle the weight. So everybody wants to blame Jesus Christ himself, Lee, and Comsey, but the reality is Lee did a remarkable job of improvising, given now that we're in this mobile phase of operations. Third issue is the broad front, right? And this is political. Now, if this was a Kriegspiel at Leavenworth, war game, and you were faced with this situation, obviously Montgomery's right. The narrow front makes sense. Even in the mid-May planning, it was always assumed there'd be two major Allied offensives, one south of the Ardennes and one north. The one south was essentially to tie down German forces, because that's a strategic cul-de-sac. It leads nowhere. The northern drive leads towards the Ruhr, and that's priority number one. In terms of logistics, especially now that Brittany is off the board, you can more easily supply the British because they're on the inside track once those channel ports are open. And also, northern France is more open, and it's closer to the Ruhr, obviously, than a drive into the Saar or the Palatinate. Now, Through the Battle of Normandy, it was a 50-50 proposition. There were many British and Canadian troops, in fact, more armor than the Americans. But everybody knew when those American divisions began to come online, it would move towards something more like 2/3, 1/3, very quickly. Now for Eisenhower, even given the Leavenworth merits of the Northern Drive, he can't go there because politically it's impossible. As he says, how can I tell General Marshall that he has created all these divisions and they're not going to be used? That they are the second drawer, and that what we are doing is reinforcing the British drive under Montgomery's command. Now remember, Eisenhower being pushed by Smith in North Africa and Sicily and Italy to assert himself, now he asserts himself. So on September 1, he now becomes ground commander, in addition to supreme commander. Monty gets elevated to field marshal, but that is not exactly what he wants. Again, we all know the story, right? And the bottom line is, again, the lack of grip from Schaeff. So Monty gets evasive, but he gets some priority. But nonetheless, 12th Army Group, 1st Army, 3rd Army, Patton is stealing from 1st Army. 21st Army Group is stealing from 21st Army Group, right? And everybody knows what's going on. It's a wink and a nod, the old boys. Now again, Smith's important in all this because he has back channels through the British. Now Ismay is effectively chief of staff to Churchill on the British chiefs of staff. They're friends, and so if Beetle wants entree and find out what's really going on inside the highest echelons of the British command, all he has to do is talk to Ismay. The Gagnon was Monty's chief of staff. And the relationship between Beetle and the Gagnon was similar to the relationship between Beetle and Dykes, right? Personal. Now, Beetle was always accused of being more British than the British, but Montgomery had this very nasty habit of being right most of the time. And again, he's pressuring Eisenhower into adopting the British command structure, which Eisenhower refused to do. So it comes down really to 3 A's. 1A is Antwerp. So as early as 4th of September, after a 100-mile advance, elements of the 11th British armor are already in Antwerp. Antwerp is the 4th or 5th biggest port in the world. Now, what Monty says is, well, the Americans need Antwerp. I don't need it. My maintenance is healthy. Because again, they've opened up the channel ports and he's on the inside track. So, result is the British take Antwerp, but they don't drive that 55 miles. They would have had 2 impacts. One, it would open up Antwerp. And secondly, it would have pocketed an entire German army. But Monty's not interested in that. What he's interested in is he talks about Berlin, which was silly. What he really means is that what is key is the crossing of the Rhine. So of course, what that in turn means, the other A is Arnhem, market garden. Now because of Monty's hectoring of Eisenhower, Eisenhower gives in. He tacitly gives Montgomery that priority on supply. He gives him the whole airborne army. Now we think of Montgomery as being super cautious. Well, nobody came up with a more audacious plan than Operation Market Garden. It failed. Not only did it fail, obviously, but Antwerp doesn't get open. And again, we've got the logistical problem. Americans are already starved of petroleum. Later, the pipeline will be full of petroleum. Then what they don't have is ammunition once the front begins to stabilize. Then what you don't have is winter clothing. And then what you have is the manpower crisis. All this is a product of not fulfilling the mandate of the original Overlord plan. And the Americans, of course, want a northern drive, and that's Aachen. So you see from 3/21 October, a bitter attrition fight at Aachen. The Canadians have cleared those vital channel ports, all but Dunkirk, and now the job of opening up the Scheldt estuary, again from 2 October to 8 November. And the Americans fight wasting attrition fights along the frontiers, the Hurtgen Forest, Patton and Lorraine. The Americans suffered 200,000 casualties, 55,000 in the Hurtgen Forest, 55,000 in Lorraine, and 90,000 the Bulge. And again, the Bulge is the product of the stationary front. Now, Monty is quiescent after the failure of Market Garden. But then with the ensuing stalemate, once again, Churchill, Allen Brooke, Monty get involved in essentially depriving Eisenhower of ground command and delegating chief responsibility to Montgomery in the Northern Drive. And the result of that was a stalemate, and that in turn gives the Germans the opportunity to unleash what becomes the Battle of the Bulge. So the fourth great decision was the elimination of the Bulge. So famously, Eisenhower comes forward, a meeting in a caserne in Verdun, and what he says is, I don't want to see any frowns here, because what the Germans have given us is a remarkable opportunity. And he was right. And we all know the story, right? So Patton does a 180 and drives and relieves Bastogne. But the key thing, the key role that Smith plays in all this is once the German penetration reaches beyond St. Vith, all communications from Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg City with Hodge's headquarters at Spa are broken. The front, 2 American divisions chewed up. War of movement. Enter Montgomery. And so Montgomery petitions that the Northern Bulge, those American soldiers, American divisions should come under his command. Now when that's floated, the evidence is obvious. Hodges had what amounts to a nervous breakdown. There is no command and control in First Army. Giving Montgomery makes all the sense in the world. But again, that's a Kriegspiel, it makes sense. But from a political point of view, it's disastrous. So when 2 of Smith's most trusted British assistants go forward and see the situation at Spa and come back and report to him, Smith flies off the handle, fires them both. Then he sleeps on it. The next morning he wakes up and says, "You guys are right, and I'm going to go to Ike, and we're going to make this thing happen." It was the right move to make. But the problem is that once again brings increased demand from the British, and especially Montgomery, to alter the command and also the priorities. A conference takes place in Malta before the more famous meeting of the Big Three in Yalta. This too is a major conference that very little attention's been paid to. Eisenhower refuses to go. He's too busy. He sends Beetle Smith with a mandate. And what Smith has to argue for is the continuation, despite the previous failure, apparent previous failure, of the broad front. Hard to sell, because the British are going to try to use their leverage to, again, alter the command structure, alter priorities. Smith wins his case. So the combined chiefs and political heads agree that the best strategy is to push all along the line. At some point, we'll either get a breakthrough, at the very least, we'll push the Germans back to the Rhine. Again, if you look at the 2 political heads, Roosevelt's near death at this point, and Churchill's not looking all that spry either, right? Okay. So the next phase is the broad front advance. Now, you might talk about Eisenhower's 6 great decisions, But I think far more decisive was the three non-forced errors that Hitler made. The best Allied general was Adolf Hitler. The first was the Mortain Offensive, which guaranteed the destruction of the German forces in Normandy. If you lose Normandy, Hitler understood this. You lose France and probably the war. Second unforced error was the Battle of the Bulge. What that meant was the offensive capacity of the German army was now kaput, it was done. And the third great error was defending the West Wall and every inch of the Reich between the West Wall and the Rhine. What that did was destroyed any mobility the Germans had. And therefore, the broad front approach succeeds. The British, Canadians, and Ninth Army, veritable grenade blockbuster, that had priority. Lumberjack, secondary attack. Unforeseen consequences is the initiative of American troops in seizing the Remagen Bridge. That's a total game changer. In the South, you've got Patton doing what Patton does best, unlicensed reconnaissance and force, which is actually an offensive. First, he closes all the way to the Rhine at Koblenz, and then he drives down the Rheingraben and through the Hunsrück, and he pockets 3 German armies in the process. And not only do the Americans' First Army bounce the Rhine at Remagen, but Patton also does so at Oppenheim. Famous picture of him urinating, because he knows he's beaten Monty by 1 day. And the Rhine flows that way, and that's where the British are going to stage plunder. So there's plunder and the massive airborne operation Varsity, but by that time, First Army and Third Army are already across and advancing. Again, the Germans have no mobility. They're helpless. And the Americans are moving so quickly, they're inside the German command loop. Command, control, intelligence. Again, this is exactly what the American Army was designed to do. And of course, the chief objective was to turn that broad front into another encircling battle, and that is the Ruhr Pocket. Okay. The sixth decision was, again, negative, not to go to Berlin. Now this is interesting because, again, as I said earlier, at the climax of the operations in Sicily, Eisenhower's sidelined, heavily sedated. Another occasion is when he's on the verge of sacking Montgomery in Normandy. This is the third. He was described as being vile. So he, Bradley, and Smith go to this luxurious estate in the Riviera, owned by a wealthy American industrialist. And for 2 days, Eisenhower's asleep. Again, he said it. Now, what he's so angst about is he has to make the most crucial decision remaining. That was Berlin or not. And that was always the plan. And so this is the last week of February and the first days of March. He emerges from his rest, and he's made the decision. And the decision is that we're not going to advance on Berlin. Now this, despite promises made to the British previously, including in Malta. Right? And that massive Operation Plunder of Varsity, the British-American crossing with, again, 9th Army's attached to 21st Army Group, that's the main drive. It's not going to be the main drive. And Eisenhower's already made that decision before plunder takes place. Long story short, he goes out of command channels. What he does, amazingly, he sends a wire directly to Uncle Joe Stalin, eschewing any drive towards Berlin. That Berlin simply has political significance, not military significance. Instead, what they're going to do is the chief axis of advance will be in the center, into Saxony and Thuringia. The British are apoplectic, as you can imagine. Right? Churchill in particular. For Churchill, obviously, Berlin has enormous significance. For Stalin, it has enormous significance. But Eisenhower makes the decision. Now, it's totally in keeping with American strategy, because American strategy was never defined except for two things. One was unconditional surrender, and two was to have the conditions that, unlike after the First World War, we would have a United Nations, right? He's a Wilsonian. That's what he wants. You can't do that. You can't do that if the Soviets are suspicious of the Western democratic allies. So you can't fault them for that. But what is interesting is, and this is the role that Smith plays. So look at the speed with which the Americans advance. There's the crossings up to 26 March, and then boom, look at that, boom, boom, it's over. That's how rapidly the front is moving. Now, if we look at it time-wise, Berlin, the Soviets now have a couple bridgeheads across the Oder. And that means they're about 55 miles from Berlin. Meanwhile, the Allies have now completed those operations west, and they're 357 miles. But if we look again at the map on as early as the 12th of April, Simpson, 9th Army, no longer under Montgomery's command, already have bridgeheads across the Elbe. They too are about 55 miles away from Berlin. Look at the map. Look at the map. The Germans weren't resisting the American advance. There were pockets of fierce resistance. Little known, the Americans suffered as many casualties in April of 1945 as they did in October of 1944. But the situation was entirely fluid, right? Now, Eisenhower had to rationalize this. He's not going to do it. Smith does. And Smith holds a press conference. And the argument is, the heart of Germany has already now been encircled, the Rhine. Berlin no longer has any significance. The worry is that the Germans are going to pull back into the Alpine Redoubt, continue conventional operations, development of their V weapons, and then, worst case scenario, engage in guerrilla warfare. Now, this was a case of a successful German, orchestrated by Goebbels, deception plan. There never was a redoubt. The inevitable happens, again, just as in the case of the Italian surrender, Beetle's doing the negotiating. So what the Germans want to do, they want to surrender piecemeal in the Netherlands, in the north. That can't happen, obviously, because that would infuriate Stalin. So in the end, the second element is to delay as long as possible to allow as many German troops and German civilians to pull back across the Elbe River, right, out of the Soviet advance. Long story short, essentially, the Germans get what they want. They delay it about 48 hours. In the end, in the early morning of May 7th, they signed the Articles of Surrender, and then once again, just as in the Italian case, Beetle Smith signed for the Western Allies. And there you see the celebration afterwards. Okay, victory in Europe. So there you see Charles de Gaulle pinning the Legion of Merit on Walter Bedell Smith under the Arc de Triomphe. Now look at that picture. That's the victory celebration in Brussels. Look at Eisenhower's face and look at Beetle's. Already there's problems here, right? Because Beetle knows he's going to be abandoned, and he was right. Eisenhower's got bigger things. So there's Eisenhower's return to the United States, which eventually will take him to the White House, and there's Beetle Smith. High school reunion, Indianapolis, where he's finally awarded his high school diploma. Roosevelt lost confidence in Smith for complicated reasons we don't have the time to get into. Harry Truman was entirely different. So what Truman does, he pulls Smith out of the army because what he wants is somebody as hard-boiled as Smith to deal with Uncle Joe Stalin. And that means Smith is now named ambassador to the Soviet Union. Now this is when the post-war period begins to go into the deep freeze. The biggest event was the blockade of Berlin, the airlift. Smith negotiates a settlement with Stalin, but the hang-up was the withdrawal of the new German currency, and the Americans weren't prepared to do that, and so that all foundered. But again, he's negotiating with Stalin. And you can see what a terrific toll. There's Smith in 1945, there's Smith in 1950. Called in front of the Committee of Un-American Activities. You can only look again. Look at the faces, right? Again, Smith loathed them for the same reason Truman did, because, on account of General Marshall. Then he becomes director of the CIA, foundering. Had a succession of 3 weak directors. Still the fight between the Army and the civilian agencies. What we need is somebody like Beetle Smith, and so he becomes director of the CIA. What he does finally creates what he always wanted to do, a functional structure. And that was one side's intelligence, the other is covert operation, with intelligence having the priority. He loved to attack the boys who showed up in their sports cars. He liked the guys who showed up in their Fords. And that structure survived right into the Clinton administration, by the way. Again, we're hurrying through this. Eisenhower's elected. Now, as director of the CIA, Truman insists that the CIA brief the contestants for the election in 1952. Adlai Stevenson and Eisenhower. Eisenhower doesn't want anything to do with it because he's not going to take instructions. He knows it all. And Smith is delegated to do that. In the end, Eisenhower suggests very strongly that Beetle is going to get what he wants. Now, he's already received a 4th star. What he wants is that chair, George Marshall's chair. He thinks he's got it. And they're riding back from New York to Washington. And Eisenhower says, I got a grand job for you, Beetle. Beetle, he's all excited. You're Undersecretary of State. Smith doesn't say a word in the rest of the trip. He's broken. Now, the only thing worse than being number 2 to John Foster Dulles is being number 2 to Lou Gehrig. Right? Horrible situation for Smith. But because Dulles will not deal with the Red Chinese, and this is the twin conferences, one's looking at Korea, which fails, the other is Southeast Asia. Dulles will not participate because the Red Chinese are represented, right? Chow and Lai. Long story short, the Americans stonewalled the whole time. Right? They don't really want a settlement. After Dien Bien Phu, the French absolutely need a settlement. And the French get the settlement they want. Now, Smith believes that the United States should sign the document. And this is the last disagreement with Eisenhower and the administration. In the end, Smith is ordered to take notice of, but not to sign the document. We all know what happens in Southeast Asia after that. Now, after the signing, they get together for a few drinks. And there's Chow and Lai standing at the bar, and Beetle comes up. Beetle starts making good with Chow and Lai, talking about Chinese history, Chinese porcelain. Then he makes a startling statement that we can get a modus operandi between the two of us. Now, the Americans were forbidden to shake hands with any Chinese. So what happens is they finish the drink, and they're looking at each other, and Beetle reaches out, and he doesn't shake Chow and Lai's hand, he shakes his sleeve. And that was his final, giving the middle finger to his position as Undersecretary Dulles as well. He resigns, he lives for another 7 years, miserable condition, makes a fortune, military-industrial complex, he makes a fortune. His health deteriorates to the point where the only position he does not relinquish is on the board of what becomes the George Marshall Foundation that is the library in Lexington. On the way to Walter Reed Hospital, his heart gives out in 1961 and he dies. Final slide is, he lived next door to Richard Nixon. Remember the dump Nixon push. So they're sitting there, and by this time, Smith is living on bourbon and Dexedrine, that's it. And he's had too much bourbon, and he looks over at Dick and he says, no, you know, Dick, Ike has always had to have his frat boy. I was Ike's frat boy. His wife Norrie insisted on a very simple inner service funeral in Arlington, modeled exactly on the funeral of George Marshall, who died 3 years previously. And fittingly, if you go to Arlington on the little knoll, there's General Marshall's tombstone, and probably 60 feet away, there's buried Beetle Smith. And that's the way Smith would have liked it. I'm done.
Have you got Mike? A couple of questions. I'm going to ask one.
All right. Hey, he's pulling a Harold Deutsch.
No, I can't remember, who was the officer that went to the German school?
Wiedemeyer.
I didn't hear you mention Wiedemeyer in your presentation, and I didn't hear you mention, I always thought it was FDR that agreed we would not go to Berlin.
No, he was dead by then.
No, but I'm talking about in the Yalta agreements.
That was never specified. Wiedemeyer, he was the primary architect of the Victory program. He served through most of the war as in the War Department General Staff. He was suspect because someone leaked the Victory program, and people believed it was him, and it probably was him. He had affiliation with the America First movement before 1941. Then, of course, he eventually takes command in the Far East, and so he didn't have much of a role at all in the European theater of operations. And as far as Yalta went, you know, they were at hammer and tongs over carving out Poland. There was no specification operationally who was going to take Berlin, so it wasn't discussed.
Any other questions? Well, listen, let's call it a night. Thank you for coming out. We'll see you next month. And thank you for coming, Dan. This is great. I think you revealed a lot of things about someone that many of us had not studied before.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.